Welcome back, and thanks for tuning in to another DNF1 F1 podcast. I hope that you guys listening in are well, and I hope that everything is good wherever you are listening to this show around the world. As always, you can choose to support us if you watch this show on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel if you're new, like the video. We really appreciate your support on that one. Of course, if you are listening to us on your favorite pod platform, leave us a 5-star review. We'd really appreciate that. And of course, as our way of saying thanks, we'll give you a shout out on a future episode. And of course, our socials are in the show notes as well. Plug-in aside, hope everyone is doing well, enjoying the interlull period that we have in this very, very busy F1 season so far. 5 races in 6 weeks, and we're in the middle of that right now before we go to the Imola Grand Prix next weekend. But in the meantime, an interesting piece of news surfaced from the Miami Grand Prix weekend, and as a result of that, we thought it'd be good to analyse that news, talk about some of the comments made, and give our own analysis on some very interesting scrutineering coming from one of the CEOs in the F1 paddock. Of course, for those of you listening in and keeping your ear to the ground on the F1 world, you will know that I am talking about Laurent Rossi, the CEO of the Alpine F1 team. And joining me on this episode to talk about those comments, whether or not they are merited, what they tried to achieve from that, is the host of the Scuderia F1 podcast himself, Mark Hamilton, a good friend of the show. Mark, first of all, hello. How are you doing?
My friend, I'm doing amazing. And I was very excited when I got the WhatsApp message the other day asking if I'd be interested in discussing this topic, because for me, it was one of the biggest takeaways from the Miami Grand Prix weekend.
And it's crazy because given everything that we saw in Miami, the special introduction that we saw with LL Cool J and will.i.am, the race itself, Max Verstappen really asserting himself in this championship, it almost went unnoticed for sometimes, or it was almost forgotten about. But as it were, very interesting assessment or scrutineering, I suppose, if you like, from the CEO at Alpine, something that I think caught a lot of people off guard. But the amazing part was not only the interview that he had with Canal Plus, the French broadcaster, it was the follow-up interview he had with F1, where he very much doubled down on this. And first things first, Mark, I've got to ask, what did you make of the comments that Laurent Rossi was saying to his team? Did it surprise you that he had such a scathing review of his team so early into the F1 season?
I think as a podcaster, as a Formula One analyst, as a pundit, obviously, I was quite excited because it gives us a ton of content to talk about for this week and perhaps into the coming weeks. But I was certainly quite surprised as an F1 fan and a long-standing F1 fan, because he seemed to hint at some things that might already be in the works, which we can unlock and talk about a little bit as the conversation proceeds. But it was surprising that, one, the comments came out originally. And I think sometimes when an executive within a professional sporting organization can be so candid and be so honest, that oftentimes there is a sobering up period and subsequently they'll walk some of those comments back. But I think what's really amazing is that F1 article that you're speaking to on F1.com, published by Lawrence Barretto, where he really doubled down and enriched and reinforced and expanded on some of those points that were so remarkable.
Absolutely. And to go back to the comments that were being made, for those of you that obviously weren't aware of this particular interview, the gist of it was, and I'll read out a few quotes just to back these points up. Laurent Rossi told Canal Plus that the trajectory of the team right now is not good. They need to fix the mindset of the team as soon as possible. In addition to that, he was saying that they are in a position that is not at all worthy of the resources that he has invested into this team, or Alpine by extension, and we are very far from the final objective of the year. Now, that objective, for those of you that didn't see the car launch, was simply put to finish in P4, but a lot closer to third than fifth. Now, we know Alpine were quite close to McLaren for a lot of last year. Alpine, for the majority of the season, looked comfortably the best of the rest. The championship position never really reflected that from their points advantage to McLaren, but everybody watching that knew Alpine were comfortably ahead. It was pretty much Lando Norris at McLaren that was keeping the championship fight between the two teams very, very close. But there was no secret, Alpine were a long way away from the likes of Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes. So the goal for them would obviously have been to try and close that gap, make some level of tangible progress, and then hopefully over the next few years establish themselves as a front-running team. I think Alpine set the goal of 100 races to be in a front-running team, and it's not a goal that they haven't set in the past. They've been quite commonly putting that target above themselves, never really being able to look like they were going to make some progress, other than perhaps a few years ago when Ricciardo and Sainz were driving for Renault, where they got a few podiums. They've never really looked close to achieving that. So given what we've been hearing recently from Laurent Rossi, Mark, how would you describe the start to this season? Because whilst I totally was completely surprised by what Laurent Rossi had to say about his team early on, I can't really argue against his assessment of the team being so scathing, quite frankly, to use that word again. It's not been a good start for them.
I certainly agree that his comments reflect the reality on the ground at Aston, that what we're seeing on the track in what his criticisms seem to be generally aligned. And I think what really compounds the issue is there were some I shouldn't say flourishes. There were some signs last year at Aston that things weren't necessary navigating. They weren't proceeding as you would expect from what you would expect to be a world-class works manufacturer. And, you make that comment a couple of minutes ago about the fact that, look, we saw this team battling with McLaren last year as the best of the rest. But in reality, that this is a manufacturer works team. And I know it bears the Alpine branding, but in essence, let's be very honest, that this is a Renault works team. And you would assume that a works team that has the benefit of an in-house developed power unit would presumably be a better performing package on the track. Now, last year, and you and I talked about this at length, we saw a ton of noise and distraction associated with this team with the departure of Fernando. And of course, there was a lot of criticism of that move simply because it's been reported he didn't even communicate his departure to Otmar when it happened. The team then subsequently announced that Oscar Piastri was going to replace Fernando Alonso, of which he then declined, and left. And then it went to the contract recognition board. That certainly didn't work out in the favor of the Alpine team. And Otmar had some very critical things to say about Oscar in the media that did not reflect well on him. And then I think if you back this up a little bit more to provide some context to the folks listening at home, Laurent Rossi's been with this team since early 2021. And rumors of Otmar coming over began as early as November 2021. And of course, Mike Crack was brought in and so was Martin Whitmarsh, were brought into Silverstone to help kind of navigate the development of that team. But ultimately, Otmar was out of a job and he joined this team in early 2020. So I think it's key that while the team may have been reasonably successful on the track last year, especially in the context of the Constructors' Championship, that was with a car and a driver pairing that Otmar inherited, right? Like he had very, very little influence on the design of that car and on the driver pairing. The car that's on the track this year, by extension, is an Otmar product. That this is the car he oversaw for the better part of the last 12, 13, 14, 15 months. And, I think Lauren's comments are accurate because this is a team that openly was noting that they expected a 2-second improvement on track this year, when in reality, what we've seen so far this season is maybe 0.6 of a second. So if I'm Laurent and I'm responsible as the CEO of the Alpine road car division and the F1 team, and I've put somebody like Otmar in charge of this operation, and we're presumably taking a step back, I would be very, very upset. I think the question here is, why did he take the comments public? Why did he air these grievances publicly? And sometimes it's in a response to public perception that maybe, especially in France, there's mounting public criticism of this team. And sometimes you need to respond to that. And you can do so honestly and authentically by acknowledging that there's problems. But his attack seemed very much centered on the individual that he brought in Otmar to run the Formula One team, which is remarkable, because the question could be, if Otmar is at fault for the current direction of the team and you brought Otmar in, how much and what accountability do you personally take for the fact that this team seems to be trending backwards so many ways?
Yeah, absolutely. And, he obviously hinted already that if things don't turn around in the short term, or if the team don't start putting in the required amount of effort, then they won't be afraid to make changes. And, he doubled down in this in his F1 interview when asked about Otmar Szafneaur's position and his responsibility for Alpine's woeful start to the 2023 season. He pretty much implied all of it. He ended up saying it was Otmar's mission to turn things around and that there is no hiding place for him. And it even hinted that his trust in his ability to turn it around will be eroded if Alpine don't improve. There were rumours going around from, I saw one source, Formula.Uno, saying that Alpine had approached Matteo Binotto, the former Ferrari team principal, recently regarding his interest in the Alpine role. Matteo apparently declined this offer, or this interest in particular. And that doesn't really suggest that things in the short term are looking positive for Otmar Szafneaur. And I think you're right to point out as well that this was a Laurent Rossi appointment in particular. So the question has to be asked regarding Laurent Rossi, well, this is your guy. This is the guy you brought in to try and turn Alpine into a much more competitive outfit. So why should we not look towards you if the guy you wanted to bring in is not delivering on what you aim for? It makes no sense to try and turn on him so quickly when you obviously were campaigning to bring him in the first place.
Especially, and I agree with everything that you're saying, but to make it so public, because again, as I read through this, like I am very critical of Otmar. I think that a lot of the challenges that Aston Martin had last year with their package with that car was a direct result of the fact that Otmar was the individual that oversaw the development of that car itself. And of course, Silverstone, Aston Martin continued to pour immense resources into that facility, into that team. But ultimately, the 2021 car under-delivered by anybody's expectation, and that was Otmar's car. His DNA, his fingerprints were all over it, much like they are on this car here. So the question I have is, what is Laurent Rossi's end goal here? What is his objective? Because if this is the way that you think you need to motivate your team from a leadership perspective, and you work in business and I work in business and we manage people, we manage teams, that's not necessarily the best way to engage your team. And then the other question is, has he already had these conversations internally? Because if this is how you feel, they're probably not new feelings. They're probably not new sensations. Are you having these conversations in closed rooms and closed offices with Otmar and the other executives from Enstone? And if you are, why do you still feel the need to air these grievances publicly? Maybe it's that you've been having these conversations and maybe the team isn't responding in the way that you would expect it to. But the challenge is, and I think this is where we're ultimately going to get to, and this is what a lot of this speculation is about, that if Laurent Rossi relieves Otmar of his duties, you're effectively starting over again, because I don't know how much more you can salvage out of this car that might be fundamentally flawed, and you can bring some ongoing upgrades this year, but you're starting all over again. And then you have to go to Renault and you have to go to your sponsors and BWT and say, look, we were expecting this year. We were promising this. We're not going to deliver it. We need to start over again. And that's a really challenging conversation. So I don't know what Laurent Rossi's end goal, his objective, his expectation of airing these grievances publicly is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think if we may, let's look at Alpine's start to the season. And right now, P6 in the Constructors' Championship. And overall, I'd say they've averaged out to be the fifth fastest car on the grid. So, based on that alone, that metric, they're underperforming. How have you assessed Alpine's start to the season so far, Mark?
I think that's a good question. And I would say a little bit disjointed. Obviously, the outcome in Australia certainly hampered them from a points perspective. I think, like you said, they're sitting on 14 constructors' points this season. They could have had a nice haul of points in Australia, but the reality is their two drivers came together. And again, those are the drivers that team elected to put in those cars. So you can't really dismiss that as kind of something that was outside of their control, because it was directly within their control. But certainly there's moments where it feels like this car has a little bit of pace. And I think if you and I were having this conversation a month ago, I would argue we haven't seen enough of a sample. We've seen 2 tracks in the Middle East with relatively different aggregates that are both relatively high speed, but now we've seen 5 races. We have a pretty decent sample. One of the things that I thought was interesting about that conversation that Laurent Rossi had with Lawrence Barretto was he spoke to the fact that he's being very forgiving of the drivers. And he's actually almost apologetic to the drivers in the sense that he doesn't feel that they feels like they're doing them a disservice by not providing them with the technical package, the car capable of performing up to their limits. So I thought that was very interesting. But when I look at this organization as being disjointed, I mean, both from a strategy perspective and from a technical perspective and from an execution perspective. And we only need to go back to Bahrain to talk about what happened during those pit stops that obviously cost them critical time and piled unnecessary penalties on top of them, but also the fact that the drivers themselves haven't been perfect. And I think the perfect reference to that is the outcome at that red flag restart in Australia a couple of weeks ago. So for me, it's been disjointed, and I worry that there isn't a lot left in this car. That's I think my biggest concern. The other thing that I'll add quickly too, just on those comments from Laurent Rossi, and I thought this was pretty powerful, is I've been a huge critic of a number of Formula One teams on the grid. And I think the current state of Formula One with the cost cap is one that has done, even though we're watching a single team demolish the rest of the championship, I think the cost cap was still the right thing to do. And I think it's still going to provide much more competitive parity over the long run. But while some of the teams like Williams were campaigning hard for the cost cap, they're choosing not to even spend to the cost cap. But one of the bigger takeaways that I had in this commentary from Laurent Rossi is an acknowledgement that Alpine is committed to spending to the cap. They are spending to the cap. And while Enstone itself, and you really only need to go to Google Street View to get a sense of how, I shouldn't say dilapidated, but how old and inferior that facility is to some of the other facilities on the current Formula One grid, that they're willing to invest. And they have a new wind tunnel that they're expecting to open within the next 18 to 24 months, that between the F1 team, the chassis development and the power unit development, Renault is investing €500 million, that from a financial perspective, they're doing everything they can relative to the cost cap itself. But to answer your question, I feel they've been disjointed, and I think I've been disappointed with every channel of responsibility within that organization.
Yeah, I think one interesting point that you made regarding the cost cap, from what I've seen this season, maybe more so than last season, is that teams that aren't performing or making the right decisions are being exposed here. We've seen it all across the grid. People can argue the case.
Completely agree.
Yeah, people can argue the case about Red Bull, saying, oh, well, Red Bull are dominating the sport, but they could have been punished more for breaching the cost cap last year, even though realistically speaking, they only spent $400,000. Now, I know that's still breaching the cost cap, but if $400,000 is going to be the difference between winning a world championship and being 7/10 a lap or a second a lap ahead of your competition versus staying within the budget cap, then that just doesn't make sense. There's a lot more to it than that. And the fact is, Red Bull have just been the best team. They've done the best job. They've got the best people. Right now, they have the best driver in the world in their car in Max Verstappen. I don't think there's much argument to that at the moment. So, you look at them as the measuring stick and say, these guys are the bar right now. That's the standard. And then that filters all the way down to the grid, because not every single team can spend that much money. Those that are, like Mercedes, Ferrari, woefully underperforming right now, considering that they're on equal footing with Red Bull. Aston Martin have done an incredible job and jumped a lot of teams right now. We'll talk about those in a moment, because I think that does have an impact on what Laurent Rossi is saying right now about his own team. And you look at other teams down the grid, like Williams you mentioned. Nobody expected Williams to be right back in there in the midfield. It just is a great testament to how much of a recovery job that they have done. And yet Alpine, I don't think Alpine would have been expecting most weekends to look in their mirrors and see Alex Albon or even Logan Sargent trying to race alongside them, let alone thinking that they were going to be clear of everybody else and trying to challenge the likes of Ferrari, Red Bull and Mercedes. And now Aston Martin are part of that too. So I do think this cost cap has allowed us to see who's been doing the best job and who hasn't, because in previous years, people could spend 2 or 3 times what the cost cap is right now to overcome those shortcomings in the short term very quickly. And people often forget how often people would make mistakes or teams would make mistakes and they can recover it. But looking at the season as a whole so far, we talked about Alpine start. You mentioned Bahrain. And I think, Mark, when we look at Alpine's season so far, there's three elements of their start that comes to mind. One of which is races where they've lacked pace. The second is lacking execution. And the third one is lacking pace and lacking execution, all combined into one. And I mean, in Bahrain, we had Gasly was not on the pace. Maybe it was first race jitters, or he wasn't comfortable because he wasn't able to get the running from pre-season testing. Ocon had a terrible race, got 3 penalties in the same race. It was almost a record at this point in time for the most penalties in a race. Then we went to Jeddah, where they were in the top 10, but they were a long way off the leaders and only just a little bit ahead of everybody else in the midfield. So, you know, it wasn't great for them there. Then we went to Australia, probably the best race that they were having, Ocon and Gasly, and then they ruined it all by crashing into each other. What made things worse was the fact that their rivals at McLaren picked up big points from that in the Constructors' Championship. And then, of course, we go further to Baku. Gasly had reliability issues. Ocon had reliability issues. The team sent Ocon out in the sprint race with the car so low to the floor, they almost breached the FIA regulations, so they had to fix that in Parc Ferme. He had to start from the back, and that ruined his race after that. And then Gasly crashed in qualifying in that race. And that was before we ended up going to Miami, where these comments were made from Laurent Rossi. So the whole argument there, where the team have been underperforming or making mistakes, and drivers as well, in fairness to Laurent Rossi, I don't think he's wrong right now. The team have not performed to the standard that they would have hoped. They have not so far looked like they're going to reach their targets. And the drivers do have to accept their part in the blame of that as well. It's not just one thing right now. It's a culmination of so many problems right now that I don't think this is going to be a simple fix in the short term.
The question then ultimately, I agree with you. And, you know, over here in North America, we have professional sports and we have a draft lottery, and underperforming teams that do poorly are rewarded by high draft picks, which are designed as a mechanism to create competitive parity. But in North America, oftentimes you will get to the point in the season where if you're so woefully underperforming, you literally start to rest your star players with the hope that you will initiate a tank, which means we are going to do everything we can not to win in the hopes that we can invest in next year and the subsequent years. And I look at this situation, and I don't even know if it's a Laurent Rossi decision at this point, although he's only been in role for a little over 2 years. But Luca De Meo, the CEO of Renault, if I'm Luca, if I'm Laurent Rossi, what do I do with the team at this point? Do we continue to use the little amount of money that's available to us under the cap and try to invest in this car and hope to see some marginal improvement when we're already 85, 90 points behind Aston Martin, the surprise of the season? Or do we effectively tank, as we would say in North America, and say, look, car's done. We'll continue to improve our performance via execution and no-cost solutions. But if there's money available to us under the cost cap this year, we need to start putting that into next year's car. And if that's the decision you want to pursue, what do you do with Otmar, and why, based on what we're seeing this year, would you entrust Otmar with another rebuild? We saw what happened last year. The Oscar Piastri situation was an embarrassment. It was an embarrassment to the organization. It was an embarrassment to him, especially calling young Oscar out publicly. It was an embarrassment because of the Fernando Alonso situation, the fact that he effectively went and negotiated and agreed to a contract with Aston Martin while Otmar was completely in the dark and wasn't even told after it happened. And then for all the reasons that you just described, performance and execution, for all of those reasons, he's been an embarrassment this year. At least the organization has been an embarrassment. So my sense is, if I'm Laurent Rossi and I have the forgiveness of Luca De Meo, the CEO of Renault, I think I start having conversations about replacing Otmar, or assuming his role myself to at least initiate something of a rebuild this year. But again, there's a cost. And if you replace Otmar, there's no guarantee that there's going to be another high quality, world-class team principal available. And you probably don't want to focus internally, because those are the folks that got you here originally. But my friend, like, if you were Laurent Rossi, or take it up one step, Luca De Meo, what would you do given the fact that we're now 5 races into this season and we're sitting on 14 constructors points?
Well, I mean, if I was Laurent Rossi, the first thing I wouldn't do is go to the French press and the F1 world press and start throwing the blame at everybody in the organization, everybody else other than yourself.
Without taking any personal accountability, by
absolutely.
The way.
This is a key thing with Laurent Rossi. You know, he had made a lot of interesting comments in these interviews where it looked like he was going to take responsibility, but then he delegated it elsewhere. I think I've got some of them here. He was saying that I need to tackle this. I need the right people to tackle this. I need the team to be aware they need to do that, as it's not up to me. It's up to them. They have to do it. And then he goes and says, I hope they make the same diagnosis. And then goes, I will make it clear to them that this is the diagnosis and they need to fix that. So it's a case of, well, are you doing it or are your team doing it? Because at one point you go from, I'm going to deal with this, and then you move on to, they're going to deal with this. And it's like, I don't understand what's going on here. I almost feel in a way that perhaps it's just an exercise where the Alpine brand are starting to ask questions, because a lot of people felt that this was just a marketing exercise by a French car manufacturer attributing themselves to a Formula One team to boost their profile. And now, because of Alpine's woeful start to the season, despite all the build-up and all the hype, having a French team with 2 French drivers, the team's going to be pushing forward, trying to make gains. And now their shortcomings are quite laid bare and open for everybody to see. It's not looking good for them. So I almost feel like he's trying to throw shade away from himself, but at the same time trying to act like a businessman and say, okay, I'm going to deal with this, but I'm going to put this on them. As an F1 fan, it makes absolutely no sense, really. Like, are you doing this or are you putting it onto someone else? Which one is it?
And it goes back to that comment that I made a little bit earlier about the fact that you and I work in business, and you don't need to work in business to understand leadership, but this is just functionally bad leadership. This is not the way to engage and inspire and motivate your people. That's not how this works. And furthermore, what it does, it shows that there's discord and a fracture within that organization, that if they can't have these conversations productively behind closed doors, that they have to have them in public. This is a terrible reflection of what's happening on the track, which we know isn't great and we know is not what they expected coming into the season. But it throws so much of the integrity and the professionalism of this organization into disarray. And, you know, if you come out in public, if I was Laurent Rossi here and somebody was to ask me about what's happening this year, it's like, yes, we are not achieving our objectives. I need to look more closely at my role with the Formula One team. What more can I do to assist? I believe we're doing the right things. We are going to work more closely on these things. But if you literally read the comments that he's making, it's as though they've already drafted up the letter of termination for a number of the executives at the team, including Otmar, that I don't know how they move forward from this point. And maybe they do, and maybe Otmar has thick skin. But if I look at those comments, it's almost that it's a foregone conclusion that there's going to be leadership changes. But furthermore, I don't know who those leaders are going to be. And you make that question or make that comment earlier about Matteo Binotto. You know what? You're always going to be able to attract an engineer, an aerodynamicist, somebody in the factory, a mechanic, because there's a finite number of F1 jobs in the world, and people will jump, whether it's Alpine, whether it's McLaren, whether it's Williams. If there's an opportunity to work in Formula One, people will jump at those opportunities. But somebody like Matteo Binotto, I don't know that he would sign up for this job. Like, why would I sign up for this job to be in a position where the CEO of Alpine will call me out publicly? Do you know what I mean? And do you know where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's going from one organization which has a chairman and a CEO that don't have an F1 background, more of a business background, and are trying to run an F1 team like a business like Ferrari do, which obviously isn't successful because of that reason, to another team trying to do the exact same thing. So it makes absolutely no sense for him to do that. I mean, his mental health would have been tested enough as it was. I don't think he wants to put himself through the ringer again for a project like Alpine. I think it's more likely he'll wait for something like Audi in the future once Andrea Seidel has got that rolling all together. I wanted to move it on to talk about Aston Martin's play in all of this. I can't help but feel that Aston Martin's progress and the fact that they've leapfrogged Alpine to such a degree where nobody even saw it coming, it surprised everybody, that has had a huge part to play in all of this. And Laurent Rossi probably saw Alpine as having, at the very least, the same level of infrastructure and finances invested in this team compared to what Aston Martin had at this point in time. I would argue that's probably a little bit arrogant, and that Aston Martin actually have more and they're committing more into it right now, so they'll be in a much stronger position. than Alpine currently are right now and will be over the next few years. In your mind, Mark, how much of a role have Aston Martin played in this current scrutineering of the Alpine team?
It's huge. I don't think that this can be understated, and principally for two reasons. One, because I think in a sense, Aston Martin has leapfrogged the field with less. And when I say less, they've leapfrogged 2, 3 works teams. We talk about Ferrari. That is a works team that has an in-house power unit development program. You talk about Mercedes, they develop their own power unit that is catered and designed specifically for their chassis. You talk about Renault, who themselves, and I think we forget this sometimes, is a works team, and they don't supply any customer teams. That power unit is designed specifically in symmetry for their chassis. So on the one hand, you've been leapfrogged by a customer team, and I'm guilty and I should eat pie, because during the off season, I spoke so much about how customer teams are at a massive disadvantage, and Renault was primed to take a significant leap. That hasn't happened. That in this case, you have been significantly outperformed by a customer team. And again, I can't understate how challenging it can be to be a customer team where you're basically receiving that power unit on a pallet, and you've got to figure out how to design your car around it, that you get very little, if any, feedback into the development of that power unit. Renault has full control over the power unit, that it is designed in parallel with the chassis. And then the other piece, so one piece is, hey, you've been outperformed now by a customer team, which is a terrible look, especially since, like you said, Aston Martin probably long-term is going to be investing a lot more. But I think Laurent Rossi, in that article that you spoke to a couple of minutes ago, speaks to the fact that we're spending to the cap, we're building a wind tunnel, we're doing a lot of great things. The other piece is the fact that Otmar is the one that led, in a lot of ways, Aston Martin down a disappointing path before his departure when Martin Whitmarsh was brought aboard. That team has flourished in his absence, especially when they were able to get a car on the track that didn't have his DNA and his fingerprints all over it. And in parallel, the Enstone Renault Alpine team has gone downhill. Their trajectory has been negative since he arrived. And of course, I want to be very cautious that, yes, fourth in the constructors last year with a car he inherited, with a driver pairing he inherited. The car that's on the track now is his car and has his DNA all over it, and it's not good. The driver pairing, we can be critical of them. That is effectively his driver pairing. So really, for two reasons, I think that Laurent Rossi is really being triggered by Aston Martin. One, because they've been outperformed by this customer team, and two, because this is the team that Otmar left when it was on a downward trajectory, and now it's experiencing a significant upward trajectory.
I mean, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Because Otmar Szafneaur was basically removed from Aston Martin. He was fired on the basis that they wanted Martin Whitmarsh in, they wanted Mike Crack in. That has proven thus far to be rather successful in terms of appointment and a move from Lawrence Stroll. A lot of people, myself included, felt that that wasn't the best way to go, and perhaps Otmar Szafneaur's position was on the ropes, so to speak, purely because his lack of influence in the team, or he wasn't able to have an influence in how the team was being run. And Alpine pounced on that. They picked him up. They basically sold it as if it was Aston Martin's mistake to their gain. And, you know, that they hired a man based on previous premises and previous successes with the Force India team. You know, he was a team principal known to be able to extract the very, very best from a very low budget and low resources. But I think a lot of people often forget that the people that he was managing, the people that he was looking after or overseeing all of those processes and projects going on, they're still there, but they're working for Aston Martin. It's a completely different situation when you move from Aston Martin, a team with a history of overperforming from limited resources and obviously where they're going to be going with that, to a team like Alpine that, you know, is hereditary from the Renault outfit that has often gone the other way, where they've had more resources and they've underperformed historically. You know, excluding the period where they won back-to-back world championships with Fernando Alonso, and even then in 2006, Fernando was very critical of the team in the fact that they very nearly lost the world championship to Ferrari and Michael Schumacher in the development race. Ultimately, they just about got over the line, but that played a huge part into him wanting to go to McLaren by contrast. So right now, I do feel that whilst I understand Laurent Rossi's frustrations, I do feel like he is overestimating the capabilities of this Renault outfit, and that despite the resources, I do think there is an arrogance there that he expects more from them, whereas you've got a much better performing outfit at Aston Martin right now.
Yeah, I think you make a couple of really good points. A consideration through all of this is Renault's history is a little bit disjointed. Of course, they exited as a works manufacturer. They exited Formula One on the heels of the Crashgate scandal in the late 2000s, and of course, it was also at the height of the global economic crises. They continued to provide power units to Red Bull, and Red Bull ran off consecutive back-to-back championships with their power unit, and then they rejoined the sport as a works manufacturer in 2015. And ultimately, I think we have to really question I'm not even sure how to articulate this, but I think we have to look at not just the last couple of years in isolation of everything since 2015, but since 2015 as a works manufacturer, this team has been woefully unsuccessful. You have a handful of podiums, less than 5, and you have a single race win since 2015, despite the fact that you operate as a works team, and Renault has poured hundreds of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of euros into this team. Now, all of that to say, I'm not necessarily sure what Laurent Rossi's personal expectations were for this team, but I think, like you said a couple of minutes ago, I'm strongly of the opinion that he was triggered by the performance of Aston Martin. That I think going into this season, I think he would have been very satisfied if they could have built on the P4 finish that they had in the Constructors' Championship, and probably never realistically considered that they would be able to compete week in and week out with Mercedes and Ferrari. And I think he looks at this season now, which aside from Red Bull at the top of the Constructors' Championship and their drivers leading 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship, I think that the rest of the field and the competition is probably more wide open than it's been in a very long time. And I think he looks at what Aston Martin's doing and realizes this season might be a missed opportunity, that really maybe P4 wasn't where they should have been shooting. Maybe it was P2, maybe it was P3. And I think he's sitting here 5 races into the season, recognizing this opportunity is gone. And I now, as the CEO of Alpine, have to go to Luca De Meo, and I have to go to Paris, and I have to explain what a disappointment the season's been. And I have to have those same conversations with our sponsors. And furthermore, we are leaving, because of where we're going to finish in the constructors, we are leaving tens and tens of millions of dollars of prize money on the table because we're underperforming. And that might be money that they were banking on to reinvest into the team and into the team's infrastructure to improve long term.
Yeah, I think the biggest indictment of how bleak things are at the moment comparatively between Alpine and Aston Martin is Fernando Alonso's decision to leave the team and go there. Because we talked about this last year, and I remember saying quite a lot that people were talking and they were saying, is Fernando Alonso just doing what Fernando Alonso does, complains about the team when they're not delivering to his expectations, and then goes somewhere and then it doesn't work out for him, and then he might leave Formula One or come back and, rinse and repeat until eventually even Fernando is too old to keep doing it. I'm not sure if a day like that will ever come, but, it remains to be seen. The man just doesn't seem to age, or at least his desire for Formula One doesn't seem to winder. But I did feel that going to Aston Martin was a good decision because Fernando Alonso wants to win a world championship. There's no secret to that. The only reason he's still in Formula One is because he still believes he's the best driver in the world, and he wants to test that against other drivers that think likewise to him. And basing it off of his performances so far this season, where he's got 4 podiums in 5 races and 4th in the other one, in a car that at best, that's probably the best he could hope for. I can't really argue against that right now, to a certain extent. And I can see a scenario where he could win a world championship at Aston Martin. I don't know if it's definitely going to happen, but it's significantly more likely right now at Alpine. And if someone said to me, do you think he'll win a world championship at Alpine? Absolutely not. And I think that pretty much paints the picture of where Alpine are right now compared to Aston Martin, and perhaps this arrogance perhaps that Alpine may have had, thinking that, oh well, Aston Martin can go and do this and go and do that, they can take Fernando Alonso, McLaren can take Oscar Piastri from us, but we'll still be better than them. The stark reality is right now, Aston Martin are already a long way ahead of them. They've made that jump that Alpine themselves wanted to make and may not ever make in this current era in Formula One. And McLaren, yeah, they're struggling right now, but I can easily see a scenario where McLaren will get it together, develop their car, whether it be the end of this season or next season, and they'll overtake Alpine as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's becoming very clear to us what a coup it was for Lawrence Stroll and Aston Martin to acquire Fernando Alonso. And I think one of the things it makes me wonder and becomes clear to me is how much of that P4 finish in the constructors last year and the P5 the year before was because of what Fernando was delivering on the track and how he was dragging that Renault powered Alpine around the circuit week in and week out. And then in addition to that, all of the soft benefits. So there's the hard benefits of him going out and driving that car, but the soft benefits in terms of the feedback that he's providing to the team so they can continue to develop it. And I love that comment that you made about the arrogance, which is that this was a team that presumably felt that they had all the leverage in the world in negotiations with Fernando Alonso, that we brought him back to Formula One after he exited after a horrible stay at McLaren. He has 2 world championships with us. He's going to retire as a member of the Alpine Renault Formula One team. And I think he felt disrespected. And I think the team either underestimated his contributions to the team, or like you said, were so arrogant they were blind to the contributions to his team. But it's also no surprise that he goes to another team that provides him with a better package, and he has 4 podiums and 5 races. And this team is a dismal, I don't know, bottom finisher in Formula One right now, sitting with, I think, 14 points. That I think all of these things manifest each other in kind of intertwining ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Laurent Rossi himself, when asked about what his ambitions were for the rest of the season, will he be amending his targets? He basically refused to do so. He still wants to finish P4. He still wants to keep the targets as they are. He doesn't want the team to get comfortable. And he went further by saying, if they fail by giving 500% best and turning this ship around, there will be extenuating circumstances and it bodes well for the future. But he didn't want the team to rest on their laurels. Now, I can totally get behind that. But in terms of amending the targets or refusing to amend the targets, do we think it's a bit naive from him to have this stance? Because you, me, any self-respecting F1 fan that has an ounce of knowledge about the sport, especially in the modern era, will know in a cost cap era, it's almost impossible to go from where Alpine are to where Aston Martin currently are, for example, or even Ferrari, Mercedes or Red Bull in the space of 12 months, unless something ridiculous happens. And I'm talking, you know, I can't even think of a scenario where such a deficit was made up in this era of Formula One in this manner. I personally think it's quite naive for him to feel that way. I know Rossi doesn't come from an F1 background, so perhaps he doesn't understand certain nuances behind what's required in terms of running an F1 team. But how do you see things, Mark? Do you feel it's naive of Rossi to not amend these targets, or do you feel he's right to not allow his team to feel comfortable with the position they're in right now?
I think it's a multi-pronged response. And I think on the one hand, I can't imagine that without making any technical changes, without making any personnel changes, I can't imagine the team is going to continue on this trajectory for the rest of the season. That it's been a perfect storm of challenges and issues and errors that I think that over the course of another 17, 18 Grand Prix, they're going to have some solid finishes. They're going to score some points, and they're going to be a better team overall. I think the challenge, though, goes back to that comment I made a couple of minutes ago, that if he's committed to going all in on this season and chasing P4, that means you're going to continue to invest in this car. And you and I like that point about we're being self-respecting F1 fans. Like there's this eye test, and we can look at that car and we can see what's happening. We know it's not a P4 team. That the challenge is, if you do go all in on this car, it means continuing to spend finite resources on it in hopes of what? Getting P4, which is unlikely. That ultimately you need to make a decision about where you want to allocate that money. And if you're smart, at some point you need to start allocating those finite financial resources to next year's car, because you go all in on this year's car, you maybe finish P6, who knows, maybe P5. What does that do for you long term? You've exhausted those resources when you could be developing next year's car. And I think that's where ultimately they need to go here.
Yeah, and the saddest part is they may have already missed the boat on this one, because, you know, in an evolving era of aerodynamics, there's only a finite window where you can actually get a jump on teams and have a concept that allows you to progress moving forward. they may have already missed that. Aston Martin, Williams may have got on that already. Ferrari and Mercedes are a different case because they have the resources and the personnel and know how to change their concept. All right, it will probably take till 2024, but you could easily see a scenario where both of them they overtake Aston Martin because of the advantage they have and get closer to Red Bull. That's more likely. For Alpine to do that, it may already be too late. Overall, my final thoughts on this, Mark, I'm not sure what Laurent Rossi is trying to achieve here. I don't know if he feels like he's trying to light a fire underneath his team to hope that this will produce something amazing for them. I think it's a tad unrealistic for him to expect that. It could be possibly the early signs of him putting pressure on Otmar Szafneaur to get things right, or perhaps he's trying to deflect blame on himself. This is a guy that we've said countless times on this show today that he was the one that brought Otmar Szafneaur in. They treated it like it was a real coup for the team. It hasn't worked out for them to date. And perhaps he's trying to use this as an opportunity to deflect attention away from him and say, well, Otmar's the one that's not delivering on this. He's not doing his job. Or maybe he's hoping that this will be an opportunity to give Otmar more responsibility and influence so that he can turn things around. As it is right now, I am a little bit unsure. I don't think it was successful, or maybe it was an emotional response and perhaps he regretted it after saying it. I'm not sure. But I suppose we'll have to wait and see. What are your final thoughts on that? What do you think he's trying to achieve from what he said?
Certainly, I'll conclude my thoughts in very much the same way that you did, which is I'm not clear. And maybe ultimately it's a little bit of everything. You made a really great point earlier on about the fact that he might be trying to deflect some blame. And I think oftentimes when somebody has an outburst like this, it's immediately after they've been cleaned up by their own boss, that he may have had a conversation with his boss who maybe expressed his frustration about the progress of the team. And ultimately his visceral human reaction was to go public with his frustrations. But I think ultimately it was probably a little bit of everything. I would like to have seen, and ultimately as a podcaster, this was great. It gave us 45 minutes of content to talk about today. Whereas if this was a private conversation between the two of them in a meeting room at Enstone, we would have had nothing to talk about. But as a podcaster, this is great. But as a casual fan, this is a bad look for the team. And if you're a fan of that team, it's really, really ultimately quite discouraging. But ultimately, what I would like to have seen is that if you're going to make a public statement, where's your accountability and where is your ownership? And where do you describe what you're going to do to help facilitate progress short-term and long-term?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure what the MO is, but there's always that concern for me when a CEO of a team, especially one that turns up as infrequently as Laurent Rossi does in terms of the F1 races, if you like, when they get involved and start saying these things or trying to carry a level of influence rather than trusting the people in charge, more often than not, it goes wrong. And I suppose we'll have till the rest of the season to see how it all turns out. But right now, I'm not convinced. I think they have the tools, but I do think an element of trust and patience needs to be put in there. And we've seen evidence from other teams what can happen when you find the right path and all bound together and work on it. And also, the people within the team hearing words that they're not working hard enough or not doing this or not doing that, you're not really going to get behind your boss if that's what they're saying to you, and then coming up afterwards saying, we need to work harder. I was like, you're not really going to get behind that. So we'll have to wait and see. Mark, of course, thank you for being a part of this conversation. Really enjoyed having you on board. For the benefit of our listeners that haven't tuned into your podcast or your content before, where can they find you for more great F1 insights on your own show?
So thank you so much for the opportunity to join. Much appreciated as always. It's a pleasure. I am the co-producer, co-host of the Scuderia F1 Podcast. We're hoping to celebrate our 500th episode this year. I'm also now officially a part of the MENA Grand Prix team, supporting on the English side. So make sure you give us a follow at MENA Grand Prix English. And we've got some exciting content coming down the pipeline to support our English audience as well. So yeah, if you could give us a follow at Scuderia F1 Pod on Twitter and at MENA Grand Prix EN, be much appreciated. My friend, hope to have you on our show again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely look forward to it and always enjoy coming onto the Scuderia F1 podcast, especially considering I was a long time listener beforehand. So it's quite nice for me for that to come full circle. But 500 episodes, that is quite a feat. We are a long way from that. But no, very impressive stuff, Mark. Honestly, really, really good stuff. Great. Well, that's all we got time for, guys. I hope you enjoyed that discussion, and let us know your thoughts in the comment section. Or if you are listening on your favorite audio platform, you can get in touch with us on our socials in the show notes. So let us know your thoughts about Alpine this season and what you made of Laurent Rossi's comments. Do you think that he was right, or do you think perhaps he's being a little bit naive? But until next time, guys, thanks for tuning in. Please stay safe. We will be back next week, as usual, with our preview for the Imola Grand Prix in the latest installment of the F1 World Championship. Will Red Bull make it 6 in a row, or will we see a surprise from the likes of Aston Martin, Mercedes, or maybe a home win for Ferrari? Here's hoping. But until then, guys, take care, and we'll see you in the next one. And remember, as always, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care.